Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Blogging Theology. And today I'm delighted again to welcome back Professor Joseph Lombard. You're most welcome, sir. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's wonderful to see you again, Paul, and thank you for having me again.
Oh, it's wonderful to have you, sir. So Joseph is an American Muslim scholar of Islamic studies and a professor of Quranic studies at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Qatar. He's the author, editor, and translator of a number of scholarly books and articles on Islamic philosophy, Sufism, and Quranic studies. He's also a visiting lecturer at the Blogging Theology Academy. He received his PhD in Islamic studies from Yale University and has studied with scholars in Morocco, Egypt, Yemen, Jordan, and Iran. He served as author, translator, and general editor for the Study Quran, there we go, published by Harper One in 2015, which has been heralded as one of the most important contributions to Islamic studies in the English language. His current research incorporates aspects of Quranic studies, philosophy, and theology to focus upon the development of epistemologies in Islam. He is the author of a recent article titled Islam, Coloniality, and the Pedagogy of Cognitive Liberation in Higher Education, which we will discuss today, inshallah.
Inshallah.
So, given this is your third article related to decolonization, it seems that this is part of a broader project.
Yes, it is. It wasn't originally envisioned that way. In fact, when I wrote the article on decolonizing Quranic studies, in some ways I thought that it would be a one-off. But then I was invited to give lectures in many places regarding Islam and decoloniality and expanding upon that. And I realized, one, the depth of interest in decolonial perspectives and understanding the current world in which we live through decolonial lens and with the use of post-colonial theory. And I also realized that many people are using these, many Muslims, and this I've spoken in Turkey, Indonesia, India, and other places about this, and as well as here in Qatar. And I realized that a lot of people are using decolonial lenses without analyzing them, without critiquing them. And so I've realized that in many ways, if this wave is going to continue and is going to grow, that we as a community need to analyze this discourse and be able to, as Abu Hamid al-Ghazali says in Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, take what is good from it and use the good as, money changers would take the false currency from the true currency. And so we need to be able to do this with decolonial thought, as it is a growing field of inquiry. And there are schools of it in Latin America. There's an indigenous school of decolonial studies. We could say that it's more post-colonial in the subcontinent. And then there's African schools of decolonial and post-colonial thought. There really isn't an Islamic school of post-colonial theory or an Islamic school of decolonial thought, even though there are several scholars using decolonial lenses within Islamic studies.
Yeah, like Wal Halak, for example, I think has written.
Yeah, Wa'il Halaq is using it to some extent. He uses it with Halaq. We would say that he's using it among multiple other frames. What Halaq is doing is really very much his own project in a lot of ways, but it's definitely among the different lenses that he is incorporating into his analytical project. Now, what ends up happening is I think that so what I'm involved in now is what I would describe as a threefold project. First, one of the fundamental things in decolonial thought is that you should not replace one hegemonic way of thinking with another hegemonic way of thinking. And so we shouldn't be trying to bring, a particular manhaj from one place within the Islamic tradition to replace modernity. And this is important because many people have observed that within the classical Islamic tradition, there is what we call epistemic pluriversity. There is a multitude of different perspectives. And, one century, you might have one that takes precedence over another, and another century, you might have one. And I really think that when we look at the broad scope of Islamic history, we could almost view many of these different perspectives as like ingredients in a pot, where they gradually kind of resolve their differences and become ever more flavorful, and in a sense contribute to the texture of one another. And so this pluriversity is really something that's inherent. And if you go all the way back to René Guénon, Crisis of the Modern World, René Guénon.
Is that the original edition? Is it the first edition?
I don't actually. I'm not sure. This is long ago. I mean, this is I can't remember when this. You can see I've gone through this book back and forth, and I reread it every few years. I love this book.
Yeah, it's an amazing book. Yeah.
Every time I come to it, I'm amazed at the observations that he made. That now people are coming out and using different technical vocabulary to articulate. And I would say that decolonial and post-colonial theories are among those who are picking up on things that Guénon observed a long time ago. Yeah. And one of the fundamental things that Guénon talks about here and in The Reign of Quantity and in East and West is the difference between tradition and traditionalism. And traditionalism just ends up being another modern ism, right, which tries to take a particular perspective and give it almost universal value. And this is exactly the fundamental error of modernity, is trying to give a particular perspective or a particular collection of perspectives hegemonic value over other alternatives. So one of the things that Guénon does, which I think we should follow through on, is distinguishing between tradition and traditionalism, and realizing that, in fact, oftentimes when we try to take a very narrow, strident, puritanical vision of Islam and cast that as the whole tradition, that's actually interpreting Islam in the exact manner that the discipline of religious studies cast it for purposes of its own hegemonic project. And Muslims are often engaging in that very process in the version of Islam that they're trying to advance over against modernity, rather than realizing we've got multiple different perspectives. And this is one of the things that I love about what you do with blogging theology, is you're bringing in people that you don't agree with.
Absolutely.
Like, okay, this is a valuable perspective among the perspectives within the tradition over time, and it lends some value. And even if I'm not in agreement with it, it can be something with which I can work. And this is exactly what we see. You have scholars of like the Farangi Mahal in the subcontinent, the later Ottoman tradition, who can literally write from within a Maturidi perspective in one text, from within an Ash'ari perspective in another text, from within an Akbarian perspective in another text. And they don't see these as being as contradicting one another, but they see these different approaches as having a better set of tools to answer a particular question, be it the question of the will, or the question of ontology, or the question of epistemology, things along these lines. And so this kind of pluriversity, which is something that decolonial thought champions, is already baked into our tradition in how it manifested over time. And so this is something that we need to avoid falling into the trap of trying to pose one narrow perspective within Islam as what we think should be the hegemonic discourse over against the hegemony of modernity. So that's the first phase of it. The second phase of it is post-colonial theory and decolonial theory. Now, when we take post-colonial theory and decolonial theory, we would say that decolonial is more about the active addressing of material conditions. Right. So when we are addressing the precise oppressions that are faced by the Palestinians, by the Rohingya, by our brothers in Sudan and along these lines, and even non-Muslims in the Congo and things along these lines. This is where we're applying decolonial theory and decolonial praxis. Whereas post-colonial becomes more of the theoretical domain, where we're trying to go into and understand the manner in which coloniality, which is when we're dealing with epistemology and establishing this hegemonic frame, where how this has worked and the subtle ways in which the intellectual dimensions or the epistemic dimensions of the Western tradition work to reinforce the material conditions of oppression. So there's an overlap. It's like your MasterCard, where you've got one circle and another circle, and there's an area in the middle where both decolonial theory and post-colonial theory are overlapping. So there's not a rough division. There's not a straight division between the two. And oftentimes, you'll find yourselves kind of flowing. So when I'm talking about post-colonial and decolonial, for me here in this particular discussion, I'm talking about decolonial in the context of decolonizing knowledge, decolonizing
epistemologies of Islam and modernity and so on, and making those explicit. Yeah. What I like about your article, it really wants to demystify and name these things, so that there is this, and to actually let's acknowledge this, let's deal with it, and let's move forward. So yeah.
And so what the thing that we have to do, though, is to realize that insofar as post-colonial and decolonial lenses want to give what they refer to as every lived experience equal epistemic value, they fall into the same trap of postmodernism. And this is why within post-colonial theory, you see that the same attitude towards religion itself that you have in modernity, in modernism, is perpetuated. It's actually a strand that goes across modernism, postmodernism, and post-colonial theory, is the belief that religion has no inherent epistemic value, as Edward Said referred to it as barbaric. They said that religion is barbaric, and basically, so it forecloses the epistemic value of any religious perspective a priori. This is a huge problem when Muslims want to adopt decolonial and post-colonial lenses. They need to realize.
I imagine it's with Marxist influence, the influence of Marxism on which is by definition is historically materialist and a dialectical materialist, atheist. And so it's in a sense just continuing the post-enlightenment project of a dunya-centered epistemology and worldview. It's not transcending anything. It's trapped within.
Exactly. And this is, there's Amy Allen has written a book called The End of Progress, which I think I cited in that article. I cite her frequently because I think Amy Allen is brilliant. And one of the things that she observes in there is that post-colonial theory essentially extends the problems of postmodernism. And this is one of the things where we have to realize that, while postmodernism has a very valuable kind of core contribution, which is that it acknowledges the, shall we say, the relativity of the perspective from which the expert is always operating. So we understand the situatedness from which any expert is coming. And that we have to understand that they are situated in a particular perspective that is informed by a large set of presuppositions that got them there in the first place, and that are often baked into the discipline with which they're working. However, this descends oftentimes into a relativity of all perspectives. And if you're coming, with truth claims, if you're coming with a belief in a transcendent horizon, truth, with a belief in an absolute, then you are supposed to leave that at the door in order to enter the conversation.
Indeed.
And this is where I think that we actually have an extremely valuable contribution to make within, and this kind of trends towards the third part of the overall project. We have an incredibly valuable contribution to make in establishing a decolonial, an Islamic decolonial approach and an Islamic post-colonial approach, which is to say, so yes, every perspective is relative. And think about this. This is in our tradition. You know, for example, when we say that the mufti has to actually be part of the society in order to give a fatwa, yes to no, it's actually going on. You know, we're saying that there's a perspective in that this is not some kind of, you know, absolute principles that can be applied to any situation. The mufti has to be a part of this in order, and this is why the fatwa could differ substantially given the same case, if it's in India or if it's in Morocco, because there are very different societal pressures on you know, societal circumstances that surround the particular issue that is being discussed. And the same thing, even when we look back in the tradition, when we talk about, you know, there being multiple different qira'at of the Quran, even that is recognizing that the kind of the polyvalence of truth, that, you know, the Quran is the absolute word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As such, it could not have one single manifestation within the limitations of human discourse. And really, in many ways, having these multiple qira'at bears witness to that very principle.
Yeah.
So if we look within the Islamic tradition, and you'll find so many different authors discuss this in so many different ways, the fact that the aql can limit, and therefore perspectives are relative, but we should understand them in relation to one another. And so this provides a foundation upon which we as Muslims can, one, build our own decolonial, post-colonial discourse on multiple lenses within Escape, and two, make an extremely valuable contribution to the overall post-colonial discourse to kind of bring it out of some of the kind of relativism in which postmodernism remains mired. I would say, as one author has put it, you know, every perspective is relative in relation to the absolute, but every perspective is not absolutely relative.
Okay. Okay, nice. Okay, so perhaps we should focus now on your article, which, as I said before, is titled Islam, Coloniality and the Pedagogy of Cognitive Liberation in Higher Education. It is published recently in Teaching in Higher Education from Routledge. And maybe I'll just read the abstract, which is quite a tongue twister, so I had to rehearse this.
My apologies.
Well, once you get used to it, it actually makes complete sense. So the abstract goes as follows: Eurocentric intellectual dominance within the academic study of Islam marginalizes Islamic epistemologies, perpetuating an intellectual hierarchy that undermines Islamic traditions and their attendant educational systems. Such imbalance, both in the West and in Muslim communities, discourages critical, heuristic engagement with the rich intellectual heritage of Islam. This is a missed opportunity, as Islamic intellectual traditions, particularly in metaphysics and theology, can be employed to offer vital perspectives for teaching in higher education. Rather than critiquing Islam from a Euro-American perspective, the methodological expertise of Orientalism can be employed to explore the potential of Islamic traditions to provide alternative perspectives regarding contemporary exigencies. Engaging with these traditions provides a foundation for a holistic vision for higher education, teaching, and criticality in ways that integrate epistemology, ontology, and ethics. This approach can provide important perspectives for remedying dehumanizing trends in modern higher education, reorientating intellectual efforts toward ethical, holistic engagement. End quote. And then provocatively, in the very first sentence of the introduction, you write, colonialism continues to influence the analysis and presentation of Islam, its history and texts throughout the Euro-American Academy. Now, this is very pessimistic. You're saying that in the Anglosphere, basically, we haven't rid ourselves of what Ebert Said was criticizing, and while Halleck is criticizing, and what you're criticizing, we're still in the thick of it. Is this really true?
I think that we're moving away from, shall we say, some more deterministic approaches to it. However, you see that this continues to rear its ugly head. It would be nice if we were moving away from it, but let's say, for example, in the field of Quranic studies, as I cited in there, there's one author who continues to maintain that actually the sphere that we could maintain that the modern scholar within the Euro-American Academy is more qualified than the classically trained mufassir to interpret the Quran. This is very clear. What's that?
Is this Shoemaker, Professor Shoemaker?
That's not Shoemaker. That's Reynolds.
Oh, Reynolds.
Shoemaker is even worse. He's
exactly.
The introduction of his book, Creating the Quran. I mean, if you have been reading this stuff for a long time, this is flat out racism. I mean, this is flat out. This is flat out. He's basically saying,
professor in the United States, a professor of Islamic origins and Christianity as well, and he's saying this stuff. And you quote him in the essay, which I do recommend.
Yeah, I quote him in the essay because this is really kind of it's astonishing that, I mean, that book, by the way, I mean, there's been a fantastic review of that book that just tears it down on every front. And I forget the author's name right now. It'll come to me in a minute. But it really tears down the book on every front, and shows how, in fact, the book is trying to rehash a bunch of old Orientalist tropes in multiple different ways to advance multiple perspectives that have actually already been essentially almost proven incorrect, especially by the material evidence. So. This approach, so it's alive and well. I mean, the fundamental thing that he says there is that we should not have Muslims with perspectives that are informed by Islam in the Euro-American Academy. That is undoing the project of the Academy, which is basically admitting that it's a colonial project. And it's basically saying that this Academy must remain an epistemic colonial project. And then another thing that I cite in there is, there's this Dimitri Gutas, with whom I studied at Yale University. He has this article in which he basically said that Muslims are, in the later traditions after Ibn Sina, are doing para-philosophy.
Oh, yes.
Not, which is just saying it's just trying
real
to...
philosophy. It's not real philosophy. It's not real philosophy. You got this special term, para-philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, if you even look at the title of his book, which is, by the way, from a scholarly perspective, in terms of tracing the history, it's a very good book. But the title, Greek Thought, Arabic Culture, that's a trick. So it's Greek thought. It's not Arabic thought. It's Greek thought in Arabic culture. So the thinking agent remains those people from the Greek tradition, and it's being carried through the Arab culture. And these, you have to find, like, once you start looking at these things through the lens of decolonial analysis, it becomes it's very useful lens for understanding how how subtle these tricks are, and how sometimes you'll just find a little passage that is mistranslated by an otherwise very good author that really helps to support their overall thesis that Muslims were advancing a particular, shall we say, narrow perspective at a particular time in history, and it continues, to rear its head. But the whole discipline of religious studies, for example, is something that is defined because secularism needs religion as something over against which it defines itself, but it needs to control religion. And this is why you continue to have new theories popping up in the discipline of religious studies. Every time the weakness of the previous theories to contain and define this phenomenon they like to call religion is exposed, you have to have a new particular theory develop. Now, what's really happening is that they're just rearranging the paradigms of coloniality. These aren't really necessarily new ways. They're rearranging it so that they can maintain the superiority of the Western critical perspective as the tools of analysis and maintain the other as the object of analysis.
Yeah. Well, very interesting. I like, there's a lovely quote in the article. It says, as Halak proposes, rather than confining and redefining Islam for Euro-American consumption, the highly refined tools of textual analysis developed within Orientalism could be instead deployed to mine into Islamic intellectual traditions for the alternatives they provide to the hyperliberal modernity and capitalist realism that threatens to consume us all. I thought talk about raiding the Egyptians, this kind of expression in the Bible. So using the tools of Orientalist textual analysis to find alternatives to that. I thought that was a extraordinary, clever turning of the tables.
Yeah, and this is a lot of what Halak is doing in his book Restating Orientalism. Is basically, proposing, okay, so first of all, Orientalism itself is part of a broader discursive tradition of hegemonic control. But the particular tools, let's say, and this is where we come in. So, for example, people keep talking about sustainability. In Arabic, we say al-istidama. All right, for all of the work that has been done on sustainability over, I think the term first became part of UN discourse back in like the late 80s. For all of the work that has been done on it and all of the projects that have been funded, there has been no effective alternative paradigm proposed. Whereas we look within the classical Islamic tradition, from the scriptural level to the theoretical level to the fiqhi practical level, we actually have, hukuk, rights of nature that are observed. I mean, water has rights, trees have rights, animals have rights. All of these things have rights. I mean, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when one of the companions was doing his ablutions, he actually, he said that, don't, be, how do I translate the word? Basically, don't be frivolous in your use of water. And he said, even when there's plenty, and he said, even if you had a river running by. So this is, right in there is the principle of sustainability that we would say. But, we, rather than mining the Islamic traditions and this vast literature on nature and the natural environment and how to treat it in a way that you only take that which you need and nothing more, rather than mining those traditions, we've started to speak about sustainability within the Western frame. And sustainability in the Western frame, I'm sorry to say this, it's just how can we maintain high-level consumer culture for a few with the least impact on the environment? It's basically, how can we maintain these lifestyles that are dependent upon raping the environment for a little bit longer?
If I may just address another fascinating point, which I read in your article, where you quote Al-Attas talking about the aim of education in Islam. And it's extraordinary. The aim of education in Islam, he writes, and you quote him, is therefore to produce a good man. But what is meant by good in our concept of good man? The fundamental element inherent in the Islamic concept of education is the inculcation of adab. For it is adab in the all-inclusive sense here meant as encompassing the spiritual and material life of man that instills the quality of goodness that is sought after. Education is precisely what the Prophet, upon whom be peace, meant by Adab when he said, "My Lord educated Adaba me, and my education, Tadib, is most excellent." Education is the instilling and inculcation of adab in man, and so on. Thus, adab is precisely what applies to man if he must acquit himself successfully and well in this life and the hereafter. There's an extraordinary holistic perspective there.
Yeah.
It's not centered on this life, but the life to come. It is spiritual as well as the material. It's a very rounded, inclusive, holistic concept of education, and you contrast that in the article with the Western machine-like bureaucratic way of processing individuals in the education system. And there's obviously such a superior, more beautiful vision of what it is to be a human being. So
it's a more beautiful vision of what it is to be a human being. It's a far more expansive vision of what knowledge is. And this is a very important issue, I think, because it actually shows the manner in which, in almost all disciplines, we continue to fall into a frame that views knowledge as something partial, something acquired, and doesn't have a full respect for what was viewed as the purpose of knowledge within the classical Islamic tradition, which was as it says there, the ta'deeb of the human being, which is the overall developing of khuluq, even of ihsan, of beautifying our condition. Knowledge ennobles whoever attains it and seeks it. I mean, in the hadith, the whole of the cosmos praises the person who is seeking knowledge. Why? Because knowledge ennobles, and knowledge, as it ennobles us, it brings us further into serving our function as Khilafatullah fil ard, as the representative of Allah, the vicegerent of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on earth. Now, if you go into the Western tradition, we see right now that knowledge is much more about, taskhir, about controlling nature, rather than khidmah, serving the world. So for Islam, we serve Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by being an abd, as we are a servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we understand that our knowledge is a khidmah, it's a service to Allah, first and foremost, and then to Allah's creation. This is almost the opposite of the idea that we see now, and people keep using this term, and this is a term that we need to critique. We need to zero in on this knowledge production, knowledge creation. From a classical Islamic perspective, there is no such thing as knowledge production. There is the production or the development of integral human beings who are living in fi ahsan at-taqweem, in the highest of statures, or aspiring to that highest of statures, through being refined by knowledge. That's why knowledge must always be put in action. It cannot be just theoretical. And one of the things we have to ask ourselves that we've really failed to do is we often say, so what is the thing, and should we use it? Rather than doing that, Muslims tend to be, how can we use AI now? Rather than what is AI? I mean, we need to do a deep investigation of what AI is. And I think that this comes on the same level with many things. And if we start doing a deep investigation, we might actually start filling in some of the gaps that we've failed in before. And this is one of the things that has happened, for example, in finance. I mean, we've got all kinds of Islamic finance that isn't dealing with the fundamentals, which is Islamic economics, of really deeply developing an Islamic economic theory on which you then build a completely alternative financial structure.
Gosh, extraordinary.
Main one.
Yeah. Well, there are many. I mean, would you like to tell us more about your article? I'll just repeat the title: Islam, Coloniality, and the Pedagogy of Cognitive Liberation in Higher Education. What else should we take note of in your article?
So I think that
description below. So do read it for yourself, by the way.
So I think that one of the fundamental things is to realize is that we, both as regards, so Islamic education itself, we have a tendency to open Islamic schools, and you've got, Quran and other things in the morning, and you'll do some seerah, but then you'll do all of these other topics that are basically from within a Western frame. And this isn't just happening in, let's say, an Islamic school that you open up in California. This is happening in Indonesia, for example. I was just giving a lecture in Indonesia, and I think it was the vice president of the university actually went through and demonstrated how all of the disciplines within the university, anthropology, sociology, philosophy, etc., were all using Western frames rather than looking at Islamic frames or even critiquing those Western frames from within Islamic perspectives. So this is something that we need to reconceptualize throughout all of our educational institutions. We can't throw away Western knowledge, but we need to critique the approaches. It's part of the world in which we live. So just avoiding it isn't going to work. That's just burying your head in the sand. But the critique from within classical Islamic perspectives, it's there. And we have the experts who have the ability to do this. This is one of the fundamental things that it comes to when we look at post-colonial and decolonial theory, is that when colonialism came to the Islamic world, we had full-scale educational systems that were completely in place. We cannot recreate those systems. There's going to be something different. It was literally a different world. And it was a world that was designed specifically for what Attas refers to as that ta'deeb, as that creating of noble individuals to the extent that we can. So that system, and this is what Halak refers to in both Restating Orientalism and in, on his book on modernism, Reclaiming Modernity or Reframing Modernity. I forget the exact title of it, but in both of them, he's looking at, he goes through this fundamental issue in which our classical frames of education were annihilated. I mean, the Awqaf, for example, the amount of land that was in Awqaf across, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, etc., on into the Ottoman Empire, up into Syria, the amount of land that was in it, the colonizers didn't like it, because then this is land that was taken out of the possibility of private ownership, and thus out of the possibility for making money for a capitalist frame. But that money made it so that all of our scholars were funded. Anybody who wanted to pursue knowledge, it was you had a system that was going to, hold on, my power just went off. There we go. All right. So anybody who wanted to pursue knowledge, you were going to be funded for this pursuit. And scholars of multiple disciplines were being funded on this. And so, for example, the study of Islamic later philosophical traditions was greatly curtailed in areas like Syria and Turkey, where it had been full-fledged. Now, with the destruction of those systems, we won't get into India. I mean, and in some places they just killed people. During the time of the Napoleonic invasion, while Napoleon was in Egypt, on average, an alim a day was executed. I mean, this is the depth of the destruction. And even the Russians, we tend to forget that the Russians were also a settler colonial project. That when they came down, that they committed a genocide. I have a friend whose grandfather was hung in the town square. They committed a genocide against Muslims, and they too wiped out Islamic educational institutions and Islamic educational programs. So this has happened across the board in so many places. Now, nonetheless, the textual traditions are still there. Even scholars who into the late 19th century were writing against the colonial project. For example, Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi was writing against it. So these texts are still, Mustafa Sabri wrote against it as well into the 20th century. So these texts are still there. And through those texts, we can actually recover a fully integral, plurivistic tradition, which poses a complete, integral, alternative to modernity that is not hegemonic in its approach. And it offers differences in how we look at human rights. It offers differences in how we look at international law. It offers differences in how we look at finance. It offers differences in how we look at our relationship with the environment. All of these crises that confront, the modern human being right now. I mean, even Arnold Toynbee, I think it is Arnold Toynbee, said that within the type of race relations that were envisioned within Islam, that this is something that the West needs in order to answer the racial strife that emerges at present. So, I mean, think about this as people who weren't really in favor of Islam, but they recognize the value of these. So we can recover that. And through that recovery, we have an incredible gift to give humanity. And I would even say that this is one of the things that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that He made you an ummah wasita, that this is part of our responsibility as Muslims, is to not follow other intellectual traditions, but to bring the depth of our tradition to bear, because it is not simply for us. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was sent as rahmatan lil alameen, and that is for all of the worlds, not just for Muslims, not just for believers. And we as Muslims, it is our responsibility to bring that out, not just for us, but for the world at large. And we have a true gift within this, but in continually chasing after the West and chasing after one approach and another approach and another approach and trying to apply this theoretician and that theoretician, we continue to, sleep over treasures.
Absolutely. And I like towards the end of the article, you actually quote Hassan Spiker, as a mutual friend of ours.
I love his work.
Indeed. But you comment, but I'll quote what you quote him, and I'll mention the quote in a sec. But before that, you say, and this is more to do with philosophy, really, the intellectual backdrop to all of this, the cognitive hierarchy of Islamic intellectual traditions. Again, using a word which is taboo in the West, hierarchy, seeks to ground epistemology in ontology, thereby centering intellectual endeavors upon incorporeal, transcendent realities that provide the principles upon which all else is ordered and understood. This stands in stark contrast, this is the important point here, to the post-Kantian understanding, this is the Western understanding of reason and intelligibility, in which the only universal intelligible is the impossibility of universal intelligibles. And then, as Hassan Spiker writes, and then you quote him, and he writes, one of the most important revolutions that reshaped Europe throughout the period spanning the 16th to the 18th centuries was the adoption and development of forms of thinking that no longer believed human beings could hope via its first principles, its genealogical and ontological intuitions, its universalizing abstract apparatuses, and its figures of logic to make contact with an intelligible rather than purely physical structure underlying the world, or with realities incorporeal, end quote. And then you say, in contrast, within the cognitive cartology of Islam, all sciences relating to religion and the world are understood in relation to a hierarchy and to one another. Now, yes, basically, do you want to expand that, or maybe put that in simpler language?
Yeah, I mean, so I use that term cognitive cartography, and I even feel like I need to write a whole article, the cognitive cartography of Islam, to explain that. But basically say that all of the sciences, and again, this is something that Halak speaks about in depth in Restating Orientalism, and actually in his book Sharia before that. But all of the sciences, it was understood that they all fed one another, and that they dealt with dimensions that the other did not have the tools to address. And this is why you would actually have a polymath who could write in fiqh and could write in tasawwuf and could write in kalam, and understood, this is what it is to be an alim. An alim is a person who knows in which particular discipline, a mas'ala, a particular issue can be addressed. And how it can be addressed, and knows that it goes across different ones, and sometimes knows he's not an expert. in this particular area, and so this is to be addressed by people over in another discipline. So, yeah, and this issue, so understanding how these sciences were related to one another, and because one of the things that some people want to do now is they want a purely fiqhi approach. Some people want a purely kalam approach, and they want their particular school of kalam. Some people, want their kind of Sufism, which if you have Sufism without Sharia, it's going to descend into New Ageism. But if you have it grounded in Sharia, then alhamdulillah, you've got tools for the purification of the self. So people, without seeing how these are related to one another, but more importantly, on a societal level, having those sciences reinforce one another. This is something that we need to try to get back to. It's not going to be exactly what it was before modernity, but it could be something that helps us address the age in which we live more effectively and gives us the tools to respond in a manner that recognizes these overarching, intelligibles, shall we say. This is one of the things you find that there are Muslims who are they're Muslims in their heart, and they're in sociology, and they're in anthropology, and they're in other disciplines, and they don't know how to bring this, and they're continually being told that they can't be epistemically Muslim within their particular discipline. Our answer is no. Not only can you be, but you should be. And this is a little bit more than the idea of Islamicization of knowledge, which I think had some limitations in how it was conceived. So it's really no. You as an individual can operate within that discipline, being fully informed by abiding eternal principles.
I mean, you notice on Blogging Theology Academy, on Hassan's course, for example, we had in the last academic year, we had several students who were doing their doctorates at Harvard, of all places. And they expressed their great relief on the Blogging Theology Academy to be able to express their views on philosophy and metaphysics and so on within an Islamic epistemology, which they were not able to do at Harvard, actually. And I hadn't quite realized how serious a problem this was. There was this lacuna which we were meeting, being enable them to actually.
And this lacuna is, believe it or not, this lacuna is even for young Muslims in Muslim countries, or in universities that have the name Islam in some way within them. That even this, in India, in Indonesia, in Turkey, I have encountered young Muslims who are encountering this exact same problem, because the extent of Western epistemic hegemony is so massive that people feel like they have to follow it in all of these places. Even here, unfortunately, the project of Education City in Qatar, it is just really, it's a colonizing project. It's epistemic colonization. And so we need to have a movement whereby we start to reshape all of these disciplines. But what we really need, and this is why I spoke about the issue of heuristic confidence. We need to have the heuristic epistemic confidence to know that our traditions provide answers to these questions. And if they don't provide immediate answers, they provide the principles for more abiding, more effective answers to the exigencies that confront humanity in the contemporary period.
And also, I think in doing precisely that, we don't straw man the Western tradition. We don't just dismiss rubbish or a kufr epistemology, although it is, but that legally. But what I mean is, we actually interact with it critically and intelligently, and seeing the good that is there, as well as obviously much that is not useful at all or harmful even. But having this nuanced approach, rather than going to the extreme of either uncritical acceptance or the opposite, which is simply to trash it and say we will have our Islamic alternative, which of course just creates further tension and conflict in the world.
This is a very good point, and this is exactly what we need to do. For example, when people use these discussions of discursive traditions, And now everybody, there's a big thing to say that Islam is a discursive tradition. Islam is not a discursive tradition. This melts down into relativism. This makes every truth claim a function of power. And ultimately says that there can actually be, there are some, there are particular doctrines that are accepted because they are true, not just because of particular power dynamics that brought them to the fore. And so this is, one of the things nonetheless, but this is the trick. It's useful to understand tafsir as a discursive genealogical tradition in and of itself. It's useful to understand fiqh as a discursive genealogical tradition, but we can't say, or Sufism as a discursive genealogical tradition, but we can't say that the whole of Islam is a discursive tradition. That starts to melt down into total relativism. So these are, and it's exactly like you say, that we can, so there's a tool, there's an observation that is made there within that is useful. And there are, like, when it comes to epistemology, there are certain refinements that have been made within the Western tradition that can be useful, very much when you're getting down into very particulars of things, but not in the large picture. So that can be useful for addressing some of the weaknesses in a foundationalist or essentialist approach. And so that can help us refine our own discourse. And so, yeah, we have to be in dialogue, but we have to be in dialogue with confidence. I mean, this is such a beautiful tradition. It has so much depth. It has so much breadth, and people don't know that depth and that breadth, and so they don't realize that they can actually find answers that are from within an Islamic frame.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you're pessimistic or not. At the moment in the United States and other places, we're seeing a right-wing populist pressure to literally outlaw dissent, crush dissent, expelling students, and the silencing of whole universities, basically, in ways which were simply unthinkable just a couple of years ago. Who would have thought?
Just a couple of months ago. I mean, really
extraordinary. What's going on? It's almost incredible. And so there is this pushback, and some of it against wokeism and so on might be more understandable, but obviously there are very sharp political realities at work here. So do you think the West is closing down in terms of its political discourse, its ability to engage with what you're saying? Do you think it's moving away from that? And the Muslim world is reviving, at least in sheer numbers, over 2 billion Muslims in the world now. Do you get a sense also of the revival of the Muslim world intellectually as well as in other ways, or are we still on a decline that you don't really see an end of at the moment?
No, I think that we're definitely, I think that there is definitely a substantial pushback. There's definitely, I mean, one of the fundamental things is that people of my generation and the younger generations, they are not enamored of the West, at least in terms of the percentages of people, to the extent that that I would say some previous generations were seeing the answers, in a sense, within that. And so there's a lot of pushback. And you mentioned Hassan Spiker before. I think, like, for example, the work that he's doing would not have been necessarily possible just 10, 15 years ago. And there are more people who are working in that frame. Well, for example, I don't agree with some of the work that Ramon Harvey does. His work is still excellent, and I have to admit that. Karl Sharifa Tobqi. I'm not a fan of Ibn Taymiyyah, but Karl is one of my best friends, and I love the work that he does on Ibn Taymiyyah. So alhamdulillah, these are my brothers, and so while we're working from different perspectives, and taking on these things, we are all part of a discourse that is looking at the manners. I mean, like, Karl's whole program on addressing LGBTQ issues is brilliant, mashallah. And nobody was really addressing that in the depth that he has recently. So these are the things that are coming to the fore now. And also, you look like, for example, I mean, somebody who you haven't interviewed, Oludabane Ogunaike, who deals more with Islam in Africa. His works are he is brilliant. And Mohammed Farouqi at the University of Cincinnati, and Mohammed Rostam. I mean, you've got this group of young scholars, and then you've also got multiple people who are not within a Western academic frame, but who are understanding some of the observations, who are developed more, who have been taught within a more traditional frame, like Musa Ferber, for example, who are bringing in very good observations and realizing how we can develop traditions within the contemporary context. So these are, I mean, I think that one of the things that we do need to do is follow one of the models that the Jewish community did, which is that, and I know this because I worked at Brandeis, is that if you go, you go behind closed doors and you can have a knockdown, drag out fight. But in terms of how things are advanced within the world at large, they know that they are dependent upon one another's success to go forward. So yeah, let's go have the debate. Let's go have it over dinner. Let's go. It's like when you get into I don't know if you ever had this, but you get into a fist fight with your best friend, and then you go and you have lunch afterwards, because you've resolved your difference. So I'm not advocating that, obviously. But anyways, these are the things that we've got. This tradition, it is moving forward. I mean, I always have hope. I'm always positive. I think that there is. I will say one of the fundamental things here, Paul, that we need is, you've done a great job also with blogging theology. You've built a platform. More of these platforms to develop these communities where Muslims can be epistemically Islamic together. This is the thing. A lot of Muslims, they don't feel like the Reorient project from the Iqbal Center of Salman Saeed. He's creating a space. This project, not him, but him and a bunch of other scholars, they've created a space where Muslims getting degrees in multiple disciplines can come together and basically approach their different disciplines as Muslims, share their research with one another as Muslims. When I was coming up, that did not exist. And that's going to bear a lot of fruit going forward. But also we have to have courage, because one of the things that a lot of people don't realize, which you've got to realize, is that no matter how much you kowtow to the West, they will always view you as other. So just don't. The most that they'll give you is scraps from the table. You must be operating within their paradigms. You must represent their. You must recognize their epistemic hegemony for you to be included. You will not be included unless you have been, as Homi Bhabha puts it, epistemically conscripted.
Yes, and there's always the sense of even amongst the most liberal, especially amongst the most liberal progressive voices, of a sense of superiority and we really know, and we want you, the Muslim or whatever, anyone else, to become like us, to be authentically human, to be modern, and so on. And this hubris is ubiquitous, and it hasn't gone away, despite rhetoric of human rights, inclusivity, and freedom, and so on. The paradigm is still absolutely present, regardless of the Trumpian takeover at the moment. This before that and parallel and continues with that, even though those who oppose Trump still have this worldview, which ultimately requires assimilation in the Borg sense of assimilation.
Exactly. Exactly.
Resistance is futile, basically, and because nothing else will make you a full citizen of the modern world. And so the post-Enlightenment project of not just physical colonization but intellectual colonization continues unchanged in that sense. It's still there, and it's everywhere.
It's everywhere.
It's raw sense, very, very, very explicit in Germany. I've seen it there, and in France, obviously. And slightly more subtle versions of it in the UK and America. Well, America's all over the place, but it's still there, and it's still raw, and it's still very much demanding subservience. Ultimately, I think. Yeah,
this is actually one of the great observations and contributions of Halak, is how the modern project demands a new and created for its purposes a new type of socio-epistemic being, a completely new type of socio-epistemic being, because the whole idea of citizen is a completely different relationship to the governing powers than what existed in pre-modern times. And so it actually fashioned, the purpose, one of the fundamental purposes of the Western, philosophical post-Enlightenment tradition is to create the citizens for the nation state. And quite frankly, that's also what we're seeing with AI now, is if you can create people who, one, are totally illiterate, which is part of what AI is going to do as people rely on it for things. But then also, because so many people have now been made illiterate by dependence on AI, you can also get AI to be the barometer of what is true and what is accepted. And again, why? Because now they want us to be the docile citizens of the techno state.
Yeah. And indeed, if you ask ChatGPT, for example, I've done this, Islamic related questions, it will come up with, it will always provide a so-called progressive alternative. It will find one or two Islamic scholars in America usually who provide an alternative. So you get the sense that it's not diverse in the sense that you meant, in the traditional sense, but it actually includes secular, progressive, LGBT, whatever discourses within its definition of what is Islam. So it's redefined Islam for the user who accesses. If you are stupid enough to use ChatGPT for
and unfortunately many people are. And it's like, and this progressive movement within Islam is like, it's really mostly North American. And it's like 0.00005% of Muslims, if that much. And yet, because it appeals to certain perspectives within the West, and particularly within the academic discourse, it is advanced and made to appear much much larger than it is.
Yes, yeah, no, it's very true, very true. So, folks, just to repeat, this is the essay. We're looking at Islam, coloniality, and the pedagogy of cognitive liberation in higher education, published by Routledge in their journal Teaching in Higher Education. It's definitely worth a read. I'll link to it in the description below. You can access it freely. It's not behind a paywall, thanks to a generous benefactor. Anyway, you can access it freely for your own edification and enjoyment. So perhaps this might be a good time to conclude. Any final words, Professor Joseph?
I would just say one of the things that you asked about, is there any hope? And I would just say, hope is part of our tradition. And was there hope for the Ummah, in some of the darkest times in the Meccan period? There was, and there still is now. If you've got truth, you've got hope. And there is always a foundation to build upon. It's one of the great things within Islam. One of the great things about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala having preserved the Quran for all time. There is always a foundation to build upon. And for those people who might feel isolated in some place and feel that they have questions, and I come across young Muslims with these issues over and over again, you do have a community. You do have a community of people who have these same questions. And we do have a broad movement within which we are addressing those, and it is continuing to build, and there will be a bright future, inshallah.
Wonderful. And you are one of the reasons why we can be hopeful for the future, because of the amazing work you're doing in academia and your forthrightness and your willingness to confront these very challenging subjects in our modern context, as things in the West get a bit darker at the moment. So you are one of our reasons for hope, alhamdulillah. So thank you very much for your contributions.
That's very kind of you to say, Paul. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Joseph.
Thank you.
Until next time, fantastic. Take care. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum barakatuh.